At the beginning of 1 Kings chapter 19, we find the prophet Elijah in a place called Jezreel. It was a town that contained one of the royal residences of King Ahab. And the fact that Elijah is there alive, in full knowledge of the king, was a testimony to the power of God. You see, up until this point, Elijah was persona non grata in Israel. He had been given the title Troubler of Israel, and he was declared an outlaw by Jezebel, the queen, who commissioned men to hunt him down and kill him, along with the other prophets of God. I can imagine that as Elijah stood in Jezreel, perhaps only meters from the palace, he reviewed the events of the past couple of days, and he couldn't help but conclude that God had answered his prayers, that God had attended to the desires of his heart in a wonderful and a powerful way. I can imagine that as he stood there in Jezreel, he finally began to feel that his years of wandering in the wilderness, his years of living on the run, his years of enduring hardship and difficulty had finally come to an end, and that his work of seeking to restore the true worship of God had finally come to a place where it was about to come to pass. I imagine that morning when the people arose, all around town the news was being spread. Elijah is here. But not only is Elijah here, but did you hear what happened yesterday? Did you hear what happened on Mount Carmel? Did you hear how the prophet Elijah stood on his own against the thousands of prophets of Baal? And as he stood there, perhaps he heard somebody else recount how for hours the prophets of Baal had danced and cut themselves, praying to Baal to call fire down from heaven to consume the sacrifice, but nothing happened. Perhaps the story was being told of how the prophet Elijah stood up and began to mock them. Has your God gone fishing? Maybe he's asleep. But undoubtedly what was on all of their lips was how when Elijah prayed, his prayer was answered with fire from heaven. Perhaps what was most on everybody's lips was the fact that Baal did not show up, but the God of Israel did. Revival and reformation would have been on everybody's lips. Because you see, what had taken place the day before was a contest to see who was the true God, and the God of Israel, Yahweh, had come through and revealed himself to be God. And so it's no wonder that Elijah was probably thinking, all that I've worked towards, all that I've worked for is finally about to come to pass. And I imagine that as these thoughts are going through his mind, he looks up and he sees Jezebel's messenger coming towards him. He's probably expecting to hear words of capitulation. He's probably thinking that he'll hear words similar to the words that he heard the previous day at Carmel. Elijah, you were right. Yahweh is God. Perhaps he expected the message from the queen to sound something like this. Elijah, I have done much evil. Thank you for revealing to me who the true God is. I want to change. Lead me in the ways everlasting. But instead, the words he heard were ka'eth, machar. By this time tomorrow. You see, these words that Elijah was greeted with were in fact not simply a threat, but it was an ancient Near Eastern curse. You see, when Elijah heard those words spoken by the messenger, he realized that in spite of the events that took place at Carmel, that despite his visions that revival and reformation were about to take place, very little had in fact changed. For you see, instead of turning to the God of Israel, Jezebel turned to the dark arts and employed an intermediary to cast a spell on him. All of this while her husband Ahab seemed to stand idly by. And with the words of those curses ringing in his ears, Elijah began to see that years of ministry were crumbling into insignificance. Years of knocking on doors, years of evangelistic meetings, years of persecution for keeping the Sabbath, years of ridicule for worshiping an unpopular God, years of sacrificing his family for his mission. In that very moment, Elijah literally saw the work of his life fall apart, perish. You see, this is how life can be sometimes. On Monday, it can feel as though everything in your life is heading in the right direction, but on Tuesday, all of that can change very quickly. One moment we seem as though we're on an upward trajectory. One moment it feels as though we are walking with the blessings of God, but the next moment or after the phone call, everything can feel very, very different. Perhaps somebody in here knows what that feels like. You see, to feel as though your life's work is falling apart is a very humbling experience. It's something that is experienced by both people of faith and people of no faith. But you see, when it's experienced by those who would describe themselves as being of faith, it's an experience that carries some additional dynamics. I'm sure that as Elijah found himself in that moment of great disappointment, he began to ask the question, have I not been faithful to God? Have I not given the Lord years of service? Did I not read my Bible? Do I not go to church? Do I not do my best to share the good news with others? And you see, as Elijah begins to look back over his life, I'm sure that he gets a sense that with each miracle, with each God event that took place in his experience, with each prayer that the Lord had seemed to answer in his past, it seemed as though God was rewarding his faithfulness. You see, when things are going right, there's something about us as humans that we begin to think, well, if things are going right for me, I must be doing something good in the eyes of God. And you see, as much as we say we don't believe in a righteousness by works theology, oftentimes there's a part of us that trusts in God to protect us from bad things and answer our prayers in the way that we want him to when we have been faithful to him. And so for somebody of faith to have placed their trust in God and to see their life crumbling before their very eyes, it's a traumatic experience. Tragedy and traumatic events and experiences can cause even the most faithful feeling disappointed in God. Some of us have gone through those experiences where we've received negative news about a loved one. Cancer. Some of us have had to walk with individuals, walk with people who we love through traumatic and difficult life circumstances and challenges. We've had to see them diminish before our eyes. And as much as we trust in God, we cannot help but feel a sense of disappointment. Shouldn't faith, shouldn't trust in God protect us from these kinds of circumstances? Everyone deals with disappointment in different ways. And as we find ourselves in 1 Kings chapter 19, we see that Elijah sought refuge under a bush, a broom bush. And there under the bush, he pleaded with God to take his life away. Perhaps some of us have had similar conversations with God. Perhaps some of us have been disappointed with life to a point where actually we thought maybe life is not worth living. Perhaps there are some in here who are going through a broom bush moment this afternoon. But you see, this is what I love about God. You see, when you look at Elijah under the broom bush, you discover that God is not actually that far away. You see, God hears Elijah's words, "I want to die." But God sees that those words are coming from beneath a broom bush. And so God commissions an angel to bake him bread and give him something to eat. You know, I came across a meme the other day, and it was communicating the Elijah story. And it said something to the effect of this: never underestimate the spiritual power of a nap and a snack. Never underestimate the spiritual power of a nap and a snack. Because you see, sometimes as Christians, it can be a tendency for us to, when we see somebody going through a great disappointment, when we see somebody going through something difficult in life, sometimes our tendency is to spiritualize their problem away. But God gets very practical. God gets very close. You see, God sees the situation. He hears the words, but he sees that Elijah is speaking from beneath a broom bush. And God, being God, understood what was really going on in Elijah's religious experience. Because you see, everybody in the ancient Near East knew that a broom bush was not a plant that you went to die. It was a plant that you sheltered beneath in order to survive. You see, sometimes when we're going through difficult situations, when we're going through difficult circumstances, the words that we speak don't necessarily match with our actions. And so as God sees Elijah beneath the broom bush, God sees beneath the words and he recognizes what's really going on here. You see, the broom bush was a bush that travelers would go under to shelter from the sun when it got particularly harsh in the day. The broom bush was a bush that travelers would go underneath when the sandstorms picked up and the wind got too strong. The broom bush was a bush that when it was burned at the right temperature, it would make charcoal that would keep you going through the cold nights in the desert. The broom bush could even be dug up, and the tips of the roots could be eaten in extreme circumstances for nourishment. You didn't go to the broom bush to die. You went to the broom bush to survive. And so even though the words coming out of Elijah's mouth was, "Lord, let me die," God looks and sees actually what Elijah wants is to survive. And what I see in this story is a God who is attentive to and in tune with our needs. He knows our heart's desires, and he understands that sometimes he allows us to go through difficult circumstances. He even knows that sometimes we get hungry. He knows that sometimes we get thirsty, and he recognizes that there are times when sometimes the things that we've gone through overwhelm us. God knows that sometimes as human beings we get upset and we say things that we don't really mean. God understands all of that. And he meets us right where we are. You see, at this point in the text, Elijah is all alone. His servant was left in the previous town. All of the people who professed That Yahweh was God on Mount Carmel. All of the Israelites, the thousands of Israelites that had been gathered there who confessed that Yahweh is God, they were nowhere in sight, but God was there. And you see, although people may write us off, although sometimes we may even give up on ourselves, God never gives up on us. And so having eaten bread baked on stones, have you ever eaten bread that's baked on stones? Have you ever? My wife and I, we were in Iceland, and on the way back, we found this bread in the duty-free in the airport, and we bought some and took it on the plane with us. It was beautiful. It was smoky. It was the text. I could go on and on forever. But God prepares him bread that's baked on stones. I imagine Elijah wakes up under the broom bush. He probably thinks that he's hallucinating. He's seeing something. The heat is playing a trick on him. And the angel gives him something to eat, and he gives him some water. And then Elijah goes back to sleep again, and God lets him rest. He's then woken up a second time. And he's given some more bread, and he's given some more to drink. And the angel says to him, you need this, because the journey that you have to go on is a great one. First Kings chapter 19, and verse 9. I'll read from verse 8. It says, he got up and ate and drank and went in the strength of that food for 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mountain of God. At that place he came to a cave, and he spent the night there. Then the word of the Lord came to him, saying, what are you doing here, Elijah? And he answered, I have been very zealous for the Lord and the God of hosts. For the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed the prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away. And he said, go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by. Now there was a great wind, so strong that it was splitting the mountains and breaking the rocks in pieces before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, the sound of sheer silence. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in a mantle and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. You see, after great disappointment, if we choose to persevere with God, we will find that there is even greater relationship. Many of you, or many of us in here, know our experience as a church. Well, before we were founded, there were those who believed Jesus was coming back in 1844. And they went out and they stood on the mountain, and he didn't come. They went through a great disappointment. And many actually left the movement at that time, but some stayed, and they studied and they went back to the scriptures and they prayed. And God led them into a deeper experience. You see, after great disappointment comes even greater relationship. We just have to try and hold on to God. You see, the ability to understand God when he acts in a grand way like he did at Carmel is one thing. But when you can come to a place when you can understand God even when he's silent, that is something wonderful and amazing. You see, identity is not rooted in past glories such as Carmel experiences or miracles or even emotions. Identity is ultimately rooted in God, in Christ. And when we look to his example, we see that his faith in our Heavenly Father endured the silence of even the cross. And so today I want to speak to the person who finds himself experiencing great disappointment. I want to speak a word of encouragement because you see, I believe that the story of Elijah tells us, don't give up. I believe the story of Elijah tells us that the fact that you're even here in this building today or the fact that you're watching online suggests to me that perhaps you are like Elijah under a broom bush. Being here, watching online is a cry to God for survival. Lord, help me. And I believe that perhaps God is saying to us today, don't give up. Hold on. My angel's on the way. Rise. Eat. I'm not finished with you yet. I still have great things in store for you. You see, in the silence, God restores Elijah. He restores his sense of purpose and identity. And having gone through a great disappointment, he was able to finally answer the question, who am I?